Bum bum bum, ba-dum. Todd Glass walked up to a bubble stand and he said to the man running the stand, "Hey, bum bum bum, got the reverb?" The man said, "No, we just sell bubbles. They're fresh from the bubble machine. Can I sell you some? They're dope." Todd Glass said, "Nope." Then he podcasted away, podcast, to the very next day. Bum, 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 bum. When Todd Glass walked up to the bubble stand, and he said to the man running the stand, "Hey, bum, 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 you got any reverb?" The man said, "No, like I said yesterday, we just sell bubbles, okay? Why not give them a try?" Todd Glass said, "Goodbye." Then he podcasted away, podcast. He podcasted away, podcast. He podcasted away, podcast, till the very next day. Bum, 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 bum. When Todd Glass walked up to the bubble stand, and he said to the man running the stand, "Hey, bum, 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 got any reverb?" The man said, "Look, this is getting old. I mean, bubbles are all we've ever sold. Why not give it a go?" Todd Glass said, "How about no?" Then he podcasted away, podcast. He podcasted away, podcast. He podcasted away, podcast, to the very next day. Bum, 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 bum. When Todd Glass walked up to the bubble stand, and he said to the man running the stand, "Hey, bum, 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 you got any reverb?" The man said, "That's it. If you don't stay away, Todd, I'll cancel your podcast, swear to God. So don't get too close." Todd Glass said, "Adios." Then he podcasted away, podcast. He podcasted away, podcast. He podcasted away, podcast, till the very next day. Bum, 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 ba-dum. When Todd Glass walked up to the bubble stand, and he said to the man running the stand, "Hey, bum, 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 you do coke?" "What? You do coke?" "No, why would I? Oh, well, then one more question for you. Got any reverb?" Bum, 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 bum. And the man just stopped. Then he started to smile. Then he started to laugh. He laughed for a while. Then he said, "Come on, Todd, let's walk to the store. I'll buy you some reverb so you won't have to ask anymore." So they walked to the store and the man bought some reverb. He offered some to Todd Glass, and Todd Glass said, "No thanks. But you know what sounds good? No trouble. Do you think this store has any bubbles?" He podcasted away, podcast. He podcasted away, podcast. He podcasted away, podcast, to the very next